Hi, guys, welcome back to another episode of Lily's Little Life Corner. Today, I have an interview with an author that is in my writing Discord server, which I will leave in the description below. His name is Joey or Yossi, and he is a Jewish erotica writer. So I really wanted to interview him and get more of his experiences and talk more about how his identities influence his writing and how his writing works. How his writing is influenced by his experiences. I think I just said the same thing twice, but whatever. So I hope you guys enjoy this interview. And as always, I will be leaving links in the description. So his social media, the Discord server, and all of my other links in the description. There will be no Lily's Little After Show for this week, just because I had a lot of trouble editing this episode. There was a bit of glitching, and I think you can still hear it. I tried to remove parts that were glitchy, which unfortunately led to me removing some parts of the interview. We had an hour and 21-minute long interview, and obviously this video or this podcast episode is not an hour and 21 minutes because I did have to cut a lot of stuff out that was glitching. So, yeah, that is unfortunate. But I hope you guys enjoy it anyway and let me know what you guys think. Also, despite there being no Lily's Little After Show for this week, there are still other weeks of Lily's Little After Show that you can access for $5 a month on my Patreon. But if you think $5 a month is maybe a little bit too much, I also am now, because I no longer do scripts for my podcast episodes, I am now doing blog posts for every podcast episode and every video that comes out. So there will be a blog post attached to this episode that you can read for $1 a month on my Patreon that you can check out. Links in the description. Same thing with my merch. If you want to buy my merch, link will be in the description and the show notes. But without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome. Thank you for doing this interview with me. Ever since you posted that message on Discord and kind of as you've been talking about your journey and everything, I've been really hoping to interview you and talk about the things that further in detail that you've been talking about on the server. So I'm really glad that you could do this interview.
Yes, I'm excited for it.
Yeah, me too. So, do you want to introduce yourself and talk about a little bit about who you are and kind of what you do and, your writing process and stuff like that?
Sure. So, I publish under the name Joelle Castile, which is my legal name, but I tend to use the names Joey or Yossi most often online, and Joey also in person. As a transgender man, part of the process was reclaiming the name Joey because a first grade teacher decided that my given name was too pretty to be shortened and never bothered to ask me what my thoughts were. And Yossi is simply the Hebrew version of that. And when I was converting to Judaism, it made the most sense to me to claim that as a part of myself.
Yeah. Well, and can I ask you a little bit more about your Judaism and your conversion and how that plays a role into who you are today?
Certainly. So I have been a religious journeyer my whole life and struggling to find both religion and religious community where I felt comfortable. My parents were three-time-a-year Christians, managing Christmas, Easter, and Mother's Day. The last one specifically because the church that they took me to gave out carnations to mothers on that day. And my mother, as a narcissist, found that a really important thing to do. Now, I was raped at a church lock-in when I was 13, which detail, when shared with religious co-religionists today, will often get me questions like, how is it you still find the desire or the willingness to be part of religious community after that. And while I have to say, given that I'm 47 now, I've seen many religious communities put into practice protections that would have prevented my assault from happening in the first place. So it for me it's been just watching that improvement has been part of what has kept me in religion. To Judaism specifically, I had started to get frustrated in a local Christian community that was where I hung out mostly because it was a politically progressive and socially progressive place in the middle of a really conservative town that doesn't fit me. But I started to both feel frustrated with being a token, the token out transgender person, the token disabled person. I could go on listing tokenisms, but I'm sure through things I've read that you've said that you understand the idea of tokenism. Alongside the tokenism, I got frustrated what seemed to me like a lack of intellectual curiosity. And this had me, I was reading a books from a list for a master's in divinity. And one minister friend looked at the book I was reading, something about process theology. And he said that he hadn't read anything like that since he was in seminary. And that left me feeling ucky. And from during, so it, pausing, my partner caught COVID in December 2020. And that's, as it's wont to do, caused plenty of chaos and changes in my life. It was really April 2021 when he had a pulmonary embolism that very nearly led to a fatal heart attack. That I got into studying Talmud online. And so Talmud is basically collection of Jewish legal pondering shorthand with lots of stories thrown in. It felt so intellectually stimulating that I wanted to study more. And as I was studying, I questioned if I wanted to be religiously active as a Jew, or if I just wanted to keep studying as someone who was unclear about my religious path. And so, sometime within that study, I found my way to wanting to convert. There were lots of questions since I already had the ideas of the problems around Zionism and anti Zionism and how much that is a part of the questions that American Jews ask themselves. And so that was always in the back of my mind, even as I was in the process of converting. And it still continues to be a question, of course, as you've spoken about your thoughts. And it's still hard.
Yeah.
You know, to this day, I'm like, and that actually leads into my writing, my current project.
That's actually what I wanted to ask you next is how did you first get into writing and how was that process of, discovering writing and knowing that it was going to be something that you were going to do for a long time?
So, I would say that when it comes to writing, it has always been there since the first English teacher helped me to figure out how to put a sentence together. But when I started to turn towards erotic romance, that was more as a teenager, and it was very much part of my coming to understanding of myself as a sexual person around the fact of my assault and all sorts of things that went wrong and or weren't necessarily the healthiest thing as a teenager. And that was also around the time I started to learn about BDSM. And yes, I am most definitely thinking of your podcast about censorship because yes, I am very much a censorship supporter's worst nightmare. I bring everything out, and I've never been really good about not doing that, which is funny considering how I've managed to mask as an autistic person so much of my life, but writing process it has become more difficult for me in a lot of ways. I had happily taken part in National Novel Writing Month since like 2010, but in 2018 was when I was coming out the other side of a very messy time that parts of it was probably autistic burnout. I've also used the term nervous breakdown, even though that's not at all a medical or legal term or very colloquial and lacking plenty of meaning of its own. But so 2018, lost the ability to write thousands of words in a day. And I'm still these years later trying to figure out what works for me or accept what works for me now. And that leans into a lot of my thoughts about productivity. Like
Yeah.
I have an author website. I have books published. I have all sorts of author work that I know I should be doing. And the motivation is often lacking.
Yeah, and that's actually my next podcast episode. That's what that's going to be about, is like how productivity has kind of influenced topics surrounding AI art and AI in writing, and the whole statement that NaNoWriMo made about being pro AI in writing. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Can I ask you what, I know you're still figuring it out and still trying to form your own opinion on this, but can I ask you what maybe your thoughts were surrounding the statement that NaNoWriMo put out in terms of, and maybe like how you felt about it, knowing that you are struggling with your productive side in terms of writing?
I was very uncomfortable with it. I felt like they were using disabled people as a prop to allow something that they knew plenty of people find questionable. And when it comes down to it, the goal of NaNoWriMo was about increasing word production. So I felt it was incredibly wrongheaded. I actually have a finished in the first draft manuscript where I worked with the idea of disabled people enjoying the camaraderie of NaNoWriMo, but without even trying to make the 50,000 words because the focus in that story was people who used some form of AAC device. And so when you get to that, I'm like, you, you need to be able to create differently and not to be held to goals that might seem appropriate or possible for people who have different abilities, different needs. I've actually completed more 50,000 or more words during NaNoWriMo in the past. But that's to say, I was functioning differently. I did not use any AI device or platform or help to do those 50,000 words.
Yeah, yeah. Can I ask you, what was the moment that you realized, oh, writing is going to stay with me? So I know you talked about how you knew from the moment you learned how to write that writing was going to be a part of you, but when did you realize that you were going to be an author, that that was going to be your calling?
I'm not sure that there ever really was a moment, and I still question it. Part of the issue is the lines between productivity and capitalism.
Yeah.
Like I sit here with, it's been probably a few years since I managed any royalties coming in from books. So that leads me to ask, why do I still have an author website? Am I doing anything like an author does? Of course,
Yeah.
acknowledging that that those questions are totally based on being an author within a capitalist situation.
Yeah. I'm a similar way too because I have not published anything at all. And so I have many friends, writing friends who have published things and who are actively working on that. And sometimes I feel like I don't get to call myself an author because I just don't have anything to show for it. So I can absolutely relate to how you're feeling and that sort of imposter syndrome coming in where you're telling yourself, well, I'm not like these other people, so I can't call myself what they call themselves. It's very interesting. So, the next question that I wanted to ask was, how do your identities shape the way that you write?
A lot of my identities lead me to use the metaphor, push as many envelopes as possible. Are you familiar with the publishing house Harlequin, for instance?
I don't think I've heard of
Okay,
that publishing house.
they write romance novels that will appear in grocery stores. Most of the graphic activity does not get shown within the books,
Mm-hmm.
and they they are very formulaic. I mean, the Harlequin has formulas that their writers can look at before they write to know that they are writing what will be acceptable. And I completely could not write to a formula like that. I like to have disabled people. I often have different types of BDSM relationship arrangements, from polyamory to group marriage to all sorts of things. And of course, a lot of LGBT people. In part, my identities lead to, I'm not my mainstream, and my writing is rarely mainstream. And that my identities and my writing will often intercept between one totally seemingly outrageous idea that informs a whole story. In the concept of my current work in progress, that leads to, I wanted to write a story in which BDSM dominant had some sort of disability, and the submissive had to figure out how to be a submissive even around someone who might sometimes caregiving. And that led to a group marriage between two couples, both male female couples. Well, at least to start, they're all Jewish, and one of the people assigned female at birth is now identifying as non-binary. But so it has all come from a dominant who has a disability, has grown to the current story I'm working. He actually, the dominance, he has Crohn's, and the very beginning of the story is him going into emergency bowel surgery. It has been difficult. I started the project during NaNoWriMo, the October 2023, or after, well, yes, after October 7th, 2023, which, yes, it, it has been difficult. And I have one Discord I'm on, a Jewish Discord. I was disheartened to see someone say that it's probably not a good time to create Jewish content
Mm.
or Jewish cultural content. was her exact word. And so yeah, there has been lots of difficulties. I have various things saved to remind me as I'm writing that Jewish stories still need to be told. And part of it is in the complexity. One of my characters, because while I was only thinking specifically of one disability, um, I wanted to work with a character who he has PTSD and he leaves Israel for the US because IDF service often enough leads to PTSD. And he couldn't handle seeing all of the weapons that are just out regularly to be seen in Israel. And I go through the question of not not wanting my book to be too political, whatever that means. Because, we get into questions, well, I get into questions of if it becomes too political, will that mean that people won't want to read it? And that's a hard one because I sit there with a conversation today actually. I'm like, I hear often enough that you're not supposed to write too much with an audience in mind, that you should write for yourself first. But I have never been able to do that. I part of my writing process so much is sharing what I'm writing with others.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of my current problem, why writing isn't happening so much. But
Yeah.
I feel that I have struggled for community really since that 2018. So it's not even just that it's about struggles with Jewish community and my growing identity as a Jewish writer.
Yeah.
I remember back when I was first getting books published, like in 2016, it felt like there were more writers wanting to help each other. And somehow now it's like it's become too capitalist, too gig worker.
Yeah. It's getting tough. It's been getting tough. So, can I ask you, so there are times where we as writers write to expand our horizons. So, we will write experiences outside of ourselves to learn more about other communities, other ethnicities, nationalities, etc. And sometimes we write about certain characteristics that we didn't even realize we had. So, one of the examples that I gave you was that I would write about queer people and specifically bisexual women before I knew that I was bisexual, and that kind of helped me learn about my sexuality and come to terms with my sexuality. So, was there ever a character like that for you that you wrote about and then you were like, wait a minute, I identify with this character more than I thought I would?
I'm not sure so much the idea of characters helping me realize that I identified with them. I have tended to work with characters as a way of exploring. Like, I have one character who I've published parts of Vala's story, but nothing is really available at the moment for lots of complex reasons. But I described Vala as me to the nth degree. Like, for example, yes, I my first sexual experience was not at all consensual. However, he was a 17-year-old boy. Now, Vala's first experience was incorrect behavior from her father. I'm not sure how much, I can't remember how much detail I gave to what her father did, but it was definitely abusive. And so, like, I engaged in various sexual behaviors to support a large drug habit as a teenager. Vala ended up engaging in survival sex work. And that has definitely been something that I've continued. I have PTSD. And one of my characters in my current book, Uri, he's the one who has PTSD.
So would
Mostly,
you say,
well, his is more situational
mhm,
from various things he saw during his service. Whereas I really fit the idea of complex PTSD being systematic child abuse that only really stopped when I finally cut ties with my family of origin before my 40th birthday.
yeah. So would you say that instead of you learning from your characters, maybe your characters take from you and learn from you instead of you learning from your characters, I guess is the way to put it.
But much more than my characters being informed by my experiences.
Yeah, that's
Although sometimes it's not so much as learning from me as a conversation and seeing different points of view.
mhm.
That's something that I appreciate with Talmudic writings in Judaism. So we have collected these writings over thousands of years. And you can see where, for instance, a 15th century rabbi will comment on something that a 10th century rabbi said. And we keep the records of all of these conversations over thousands of years. And I like to communicate with my characters in very similar manner.
So, speaking about characters and kind of how they are informed by our experiences and how we connect to our characters, I wanted to ask you, so I know you've talked about living in an area that doesn't reflect your experiences, that you feel like you don't necessarily belong or like you don't fit the status quo, which I can absolutely relate to. Living in a very white, very almost monotheistic area. And so I wanted to ask you, how has writing helped you explore that side of you that you maybe wouldn't be able to explore with your neighbors?
Well, in part, it is definitely about community and having people to talk with. I mean, my characters were there and continue to be there for community, especially as social media changes. Like, I think recently, Mark Zuckerberg admitted in I think it was Senate questioning the whole thing with is Meta becoming a monopoly. But he admitted that it really isn't about connecting people, connecting friends anymore. I forget how he described what it is now, but I sit there with not connecting friends, whether knowing them offline or just online. Platforms like Facebook, as it used to be, have been such an important part of my community. And so I continue to struggle with figuring out where to go now. Like, I don't use Twitter since in the days before Elon Musk took over. I deleted my account there. And I know there's other places, but I have struggled to really take on finding community in places like Blue Sky. I think I've done the best on Discord, and partly that's just my daughter, who's she's 26, and as Facebook was going nasty, she talked a lot about Discord, and I have found it to be a safer space than a lot of other social media. But if it meets all of my needs is definitely a good question. And I continue to be like, do I need to find other groups about different things? But like I know I had tried various at least one autistic group on here on Discord and it got frustrating. And I ended up leaving it because it had one rule that seemed really good. The idea that if someone else had posted something and no one had responded to it, you needed to wait at least 15 minutes before bringing up another conversation topic. It seemed like sometimes that killed off conversation, though.
Yeah.
And I would sit there waiting for interest in a topic or waiting for the time to pass where you could bring up a new topic. And so I did end up leaving that group. And sometimes I feel like, as an autistic person, I struggle for places where my whole autistic self is actually okay to be openly who I am.
That reminds me of how the server that we're in came to be about. I created that server because I wanted to join a community with writers, but it turned out that the server that I had joined told us that we were not allowed to use tone tags, which, as an autistic person, I think tone tags can be very beneficial, especially if you're trying to make a joke, but maybe the joke sounds a little mean if it isn't read as a joke. So you want to be able to specify, this is just a joke, like I don't mean this in a, like I mean this in a lighthearted way, and so tone tags would be really useful. So I looked at their rules and they said tone tags were not allowed, and it felt very isolating. And I wanted to create a server where we were able to use tone tags and we were able to modify the way that we communicate to be more inclusive of us, of people who are autistic and who rely on tone tags.
Yeah. I am not always good at remembering to use tone tags, but I definitely appreciate when people do use them and feel comfortable using them.
Yeah, I know you've been talking about this kind of on and off, but how has your journey with Judaism influenced and informed your writing?
So, a big question within myself was, when would I feel comfortable bringing Jewish topics into my writing? And this was an interesting one for me because in with other topics, writing about them has helped me in my journey, but that didn't feel right with Judaism. And unfortunately, I am still at a loss for words of why it felt different. To explain, in the process of learning ASL, I had brought in a lot about deafness and deaf community, and even I've worked with deaf characters and up as well hearing characters learning ASL. I haven't finished any of those books, haven't published any of them, but I can say that it writing about all of everything to do with deafness as I have learned it as a hearing person. That's all been so in my writing. So I don't know why Judaism has felt like an off limits topic for quite a while, but it has. So like that my current work with very self-consciously a Jewish work with mostly Jewish characters, at least the main characters. I didn't start even really researching extra topics I would need to know about that until after my conversion was official. It felt like I could do that without being appropriative or engaging it in it somehow else in a wrong manner. So another interesting piece has been I write erotic romance. How much is erotic? How much is graphic? That can very much depend, but I had all sorts of questions about if it was okay. Would it be totally wrong for me as a Jewish convert to put those two things together? I mean, totally ignoring the fact that, of course, Jewish people have sex in many ways just like non-Jewish people. To bring the term imposter syndrome back, that's another thing that I struggle with in Judaism. It most often comes out when I'm getting ready to lead a Torah study. And I'm like, who said that I know enough about the Torah to lead other people in studying it? Now, my synagogue, the administrator of it, she will joke that I can run circles around her in Hebrew. I'm like, yeah, yes, thank you for that reminder. I wish it helped me to feel more confident as a teacher, but that imposter syndrome is there, like
Yeah.
constantly.
So I kind of want to blend these next two questions together. The first question would be, how did you find Judaism? And perhaps what is or what has been the hardest thing for you when trying to find a space or a community? I feel like these can kind of go hand in hand.
So, the Masters in Divinity reading list I had mentioned earlier when I about conversion. I started trying to learn Hebrew. Now, a retired Presbyterian minister friend of mine, he had given me his biblical Hebrew textbook, and he said that he was glad to give it to someone else who was hopefully going to be interested in it. He hated the class. And that was one of those things that informed me that when I was starting to feel extra uncomfortable in that Christian community, and I sat there thinking, but Christianity came from Judaism. Judaism finds Hebrew very important. And they felt like uncomfortable connections to me. How could he say that he hated learning about Hebrew? So once I was looking at his book, I found it hard to think through the way Hebrew would sound just by looking at a book, which led me to Duolingo, which teaches modern Hebrew, by the way, not biblical Hebrew. A great comparison I've learned now from one biblical Hebrew teacher. The difference between modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew is like modern English and Shakespeare. You need just a little bit of extra help to get it, but you can still kind of understand. So once I was on Duolingo learning modern Hebrew, I started to get interested in culture. Well, like of modern Israel, but that was all sorts of complicated because, well, what the totality of what modern Israel is. And the fact that while I don't identify specifically under the whole rubric of Zionism, anti Zionism, I have this thought that all modern nation states need to be critiqued. And that led me to, well, there's the problems of how too many American Jews hold Israel, almost the nation state Israel, as like so important. And it's like, no, it's a nation state, just like any other nation state. And that all nation states do good and bad. And you can't put a religion on a nation state.
Mm-hmm.
Nationalism has gone wrong so many times in the
Yeah.
past. And I think I wanted to learn so much more because I wanted to understand what I was critiquing and have not just understanding but also knowledge in critiquing. And that led me, of course, to community. Unfortunately, it hasn't led so much to community around fiction writing, but it has led to community. Like, I'm involved in Shalmala, anti Zionist yeshiva. That's the Hebrew word for school. And in a way, it reminds me, it's like, okay, this is community of one form. And it could actually include writing community as well. But
Yeah.
I think right now, with how extreme everything is, it's almost hard to remember art, to
Yeah.
enjoy art. And I do
Mm-hmm.
question how much of that is making it harder for my writing process. And I've had to look at sometimes fiction just doesn't get written in a specific. I might end up watching. There's been a big conversation about the ideas of talking about Palestinians and the hostages that are still being held. I haven't put any comments into that conversation, but it has been one of the big things that I've been watching and taking in today. And so part of that is I question how much I'm just taking in a lot of stuff. Like part of my reading right now has been the whole I might mispronounce it, COINTELPRO, started by J. Edgar Hoover by in the FBI. It works out to counterintelligence. I forget what the last it he was getting the FBI to specifically study, disrupt, and otherwise prevent Black nationalism, just Black people looking for civil rights. Black Panthers were among their targets. Of course, it has also included groups like the American Indian movement, Leonard Pelletier. And while it isn't supposedly COINTELPRO, but very much the same methods, looking at Puerto Rican independence. So that has been one portion of my reading.
Yeah,
A
now that
lot of
you
I do a lot of reading, and it isn't always so easy to see how the topics I'm reading might figure into erotic romance. And that leads back to, well, obviously, I'm not writing anything mainstream enough that it's going to appear on a grocery store shelf, for instance. I have a feeling I got far off from your last question.
That's okay. Everything, I just want to say, because I know you've been struggling with creating, especially after NaNoWriMo did what it did, which
Mm.
I think you're going to really enjoy my next podcast episode where I talk about a lot of the things that we're talking about now. But I just wanted to let you know that I think the work that you are doing with your writing is very important, especially when it comes to educational topics. Some people might, if you tell them I write erotica, they might be like, how is that educational in any way? But I personally think your work is very educational, not only educational but beneficial also. And so I just wanted to let you know that that's what I think about your work and how you're approaching certain topics. I think it's very important.
Thank you very much. And yeah, that is definitely the perspective at which I come to writing. And I find it funny because, you know, exactly, people will come to what I write with assumptions, and it's like, but what I bring isn't going to become a nice movie. It's like thinking about how 50 Shades of Grey made it so much more acceptable for especially women to read erotic works. But yet there wasn't a lot of educational stuff in those books. I remember when they came out, there is a scene in which Hegel exerciser balls are used. So, not needing to go into what the scene actually was, but the fact that after that, I saw a review online where a woman was upset that she could not return her exerciser balls because they did not work in the way that they did in the 50 Shades of Grey scene. The only problem was the scene wasn't based in reality at all. And I like to have my graphic scenes based in reality. Like there's one I know I have to rewrite because I had talked more with a nurse friend who specifically works with patients who have gotten an ostomy. And I did something wrong where I included an activity that is not at all recommended after ostomy surgery has happened. I'm not sure how many authors would actually give a care.
I once, so I write sex scenes too, and one time there was this person who was also wanting to get into writing a very sexy book. And she gave me a draft to read of one of her sex scenes, and I was kind of reading it like, this doesn't make any sense. And it wasn't anything like BDSM, like how you write, where you almost have to be extra careful of how you describe things. It was just a plain old sex scene, nothing fancy. And I was reading it and I was like, the positions don't really make sense. So, yeah, people are kind of all too um, willing to write sex scenes kind of willy nilly, even if the anatomy doesn't make sense.
I know one piece of how I write definitely is informed by what I feel is a general lack of good, honest sexual education. Like, it frustrates me when people will say it's escapism, it's fantasy, it doesn't have to be real. And I'm like, that's fine for someone to say who is mainstream. Oh, I am writing for queer people who don't see ourselves in blockbuster hits. The bodice ripper type book, it doesn't have a lot for me as a person whose gender is complex. And
Yeah.
I still remember when my 26-year-old was a teenager, the common moments I would hear of mom of a friend is saying that they think they want to do this with their girlfriend. Is that even safe or possible? And I would come and answer the question as much as I could before sending the person off to a website like Scarlet, which thank goodness they exist. I wish they had existed when I was a teenager and struggling because I remember one year in high school when my abstinence only teaching high school, our AIDS assembly that year was a group of girls doing an interpretive dance to a Madonna song. And the town I live in now, our health department, when they get nurses in to do any sort of sexual education, they can't say the word condom. I mean, not that I'm writing for teenagers, but
Mm-hmm.
I know those teenagers will eventually become adults. And I'm like, I want my sex scenes to be just educational enough that maybe someone will have safer and better sex in their actual lives.
And maybe even reading your books will lead them to a community that can teach them about safe sex.
Right.
So, kind of moving a little bit whiplashy, but so you recently talked about autism, and you've mentioned throughout this interview that you have autism. So do I. And so I wanted to ask, how has that played a role, not just in your day to day life, but also in your writing?
So, to start with, I don't have an official diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
and at this point, the reasons are many why I'm not even trying to get an official
Yeah.
diagnosis.
Yep.
But I can look back and say I can see places where I was delayed, and I'm 47, and I speak, and I was assigned female at birth, all big things against me for getting a diagnosis as a child, especially given my age. But I've always had that sense of being different that is talked about by so many people who are autistic, whether we have official diagnoses or not. I was 36 when a dear friend put forward the idea that maybe I was autistic, and I started to read a lot. And thankfully, there was enough of a growing community online that I had stuff to read and I had people to talk. And I definitely came to accept myself as autistic. I'm not sure how much I started to change then. And that's part of why I think that around 2017, 2018, that I definitely was having an autistic burnout because I hadn't allowed myself to change too much. I wasn't allowing myself to stim as much as I probably should have. For
Mm-hmm.
instance, I was still trying to be too productive and capable and ignoring messages from from my body mind that were probably saying that I should slow down in different ways. However, I think in part, as I was coming to accept my autism, in ways it definitely showed up in some of my character. I actually have a short story in a collection where I had to argue with the editor about this. I didn't want my character to have sex on the first date. Or actually, it was the second date, but I still didn't think that sex should happen. Because after all, as an autistic person, it can be difficult, and there are so many sensory issues. And while part of what I showed in the story, they went to a bookstore, I think it was, and she had a meltdown. And it's like, how do you expect someone to have a meltdown and then want to be having sex? I think I managed to get them to engage in a little foreplay. And that was it. It was like, no, the story I wanted to tell in a disability focused collection, and I wanted an autistic woman, and not to do like what I feel mainstream media would want us to do, to like be like, oh yes, I'm autistic, but it doesn't really make me all that different, because I don't think we see too much of that story already, and it doesn't fit so many of us.
Yeah, it's very unrealistic.
Yeah, I think that as an autistic and a writer, I'm still looking for community where I really it seems sometimes like I kind of fit somewhere, but not really, which in its way leans back into Judaism. I've once said to a friend who was struggling to feel okay around anti Zionists that I don't expect to feel comfortable. I don't expect anywhere to be a perfect. And that's why, even though I am not a very, I am not a specific anti Zionist, I feel comfortable around many of them.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, speaking about Zionism and kind of also where I stand, as you know, I am anti Zionist as well. But I think a lot of anti Zionist people, what we have in common is that we are never anti Jewish. We are anti a religious state that perpetuates genocide. That is kind of where we stand. And so I think if you were ever to meet someone who was an anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish, they're not understanding anything. I think that that's where they're uneducated, definitely, because I don't think it's appropriate. I mean, and I'm not, Jewish, so you tell me how you feel about this, but I don't think it's appropriate to equate Zionism with Judaism when a lot of Jewish people are also anti-Zionist.
Right, very much. And I I think the problem we get back to is mixed messages among American Judaism, where too many people really have been taught that the idea Israel right or wrong, and it can be really hard when that's what you've been taught all of your life, and then you suddenly get into a space where you get to learn the full picture.
Yeah. And then I just think, especially like with politicians, when the university encampments and protests were happening, a lot of politicians came out and said those university students are anti Semitic, they're against Jewish people. And I think media also has a lot to do with how that message is spread about how being against Zionism equals being against Judaism, when that's not the case at all, and it never has
Right.
been and it never will be.
Yeah. But it gets into what can be shown or said in sound bites.
Well, in that case, so your dog can have the best nap ever. I wanted to ask one last question, and that is, where can people find you?
So I have my website, which Joelle Castile author, all one word, .com. Now I have my about me contact page, which has all of my socials, but then of course it's like whether or not I'm actually active. Like, I have a Facebook page. I recently got a message that it's been inactive for long enough that they might delete it. I don't know if that will actually happen, though. Whether or not they'll delete it or whether or not I'll manage to post on it, these are all good questions. I always have ideas to do stuff. It's like I actually said to myself, well, if I do this interview that you are asking me to do, it's kind of like productivity. I might manage to get it to encourage me to do other productive things. Whether or
Well,
not that's the case, we'll see.
Well, I will be sure to link your website and your YouTube channel in the description so that people can easily click on that. But highly encourage people to go visit your own website.
And yes, you can almost tell on my YouTube channel, it's very funny, posting that happened before 2018 and posting that happened since then.
Yeah.
And there's also the very fun watching as I learned more things about excessive, like trying to have not use the auto captions, but to actually upload my own captions is
Yeah.
a thing. And I've played with trying to figure out audio descriptions, for instance.
Yeah, something that I struggle with on my YouTube channel too, because you have to handwrite and correct everything.
hmm Yes, and I will admit that sometimes trying to be accessible, working through all captions and everything, it does slow down my posting most definitely. No matter how much I'm feeling like I could or should be motivated to do stuff, trying to be accessible makes it much more difficult because trying to learn a new skill like that, trying to learn new knowledge, if I don't understand it very much at first, it's likely to cause autistic meltdown.
Yeah.
And I'm still trying to get to the point where a meltdown doesn't mean that I'm not functional for the rest of the day. But that is definitely still an issue I struggle with.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experiences with how your life has influenced your writing. And yeah, so thank you so much.
And thank you for having me.
That is it for this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoy. Please let me know what you think and remember to check out the links in the description. Also, I think you can tell that Yossi and I kind of differ a little bit on opinions regarding specific things, but I still thought it would be important to talk to him and get his perspective on what it's like to be a Jewish author that is also trans and disabled. He has a very unique perspective on life, and so I thought that would be really interesting to talk about this week. And it's a nice transition for next week's episode, where I will be talking about similar kind of things, but from my own perspective, of course. And so I hope you stay tuned for that. But yeah, let me know what you guys think, and I will see you guys next week with another episode. I always forget to do this at the end of every episode, but also please don't forget to like and subscribe or give my podcast a follow and review my podcast. If you guys are really enjoying my episodes, go ahead and give me a review. Let me know what you think or comment down below what you think. Either works. But yeah, okay, now I will see you guys next week.